Okay, so I left off last time with the idea that 1781 was literally going to be the make or break year for the revolution. There was a sense, not that we know the story is coming to its end or climax, but people back then knew this is when something definitive has to happen, either on the British side or on the American, or more appropriately, the Allies side, the American and French. Things were pretty bad. If we go back and recap 1780, the Army is unpaid, the Army is frustrated, the officer corps, there are grumblings about an end of the war where they will not be taken care of in the European style of officers who had served, and they believe given so much. That would be back pay, that would be some type of pension or half pay for the remainder of their life. Would that even be feasible in the American mode of the aftermath of the revolution? And then, of course, you got the news that the nation doesn't have money or the ability to raise money with the government that was in place. The Articles of Confederation is a revolutionary document, but it's also a document based on the thought process of the revolution. Weak central power that you can't basically force or coerce the states into doing what you want them to do. Power exists in the 1780s in the states in America. And that's the way this generation wanted things to be. But immediately before even the Articles of Confederation had been approved, now they had to be ratified by enough states so it goes into law. That didn't happen until 1781. Before it even becomes the official Constitution, even though they're operating under a lot of the rules under the Articles of Confederation, there is a significant part of the population that thinks it's just not up to the task of handling the challenges in the war and possibly even those that happen afterwards. So it's the beginning of a movement of officers in the Army, of veterans who had served either in the militia or in the Continental Line, as it was called, the Continental Army, people in the state level and people in national politics who served in the Congress and, of course, were term limited. You can imagine they're frustrated. They're getting to, again, understand the mechanisms of government and what you needed to do to get things done. And then you're told you can only serve this many years, 3 out of 6 years, or whatever it was actually put in place for the Articles of Confederation. They have to return to their respective state. Some just go leaving the capital, wherever the capital happens to be that year or month, and go to their respective state and say, the hell with it, I'm done with all this. I'm not going back. I can do more things in my home state, fill in the blank, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Virginia, South Carolina, whatever the case may be. Then we have, of course, the disastrous campaign in the American South in 1780. Savannah Falls, 1779, followed by Charleston with the surrender of almost 7,000 troops in May 1780. Cornwallis's campaign to pacify the Carolinas looks like by the summer of 1780 it's going to be a complete success. The Congress had decided not to consult Washington, but basically to say, because he shamelessly lobbied for it, to send Horatio Gates down to Carolina. He meets his comeuppance at Camden in August of 1780 in central South Carolina, near what's now Columbia, capital. It doesn't go very well, of course. He's chased off. Congress replaces him with someone that Washington wanted in the first place, Nathaniel Greene. Then, of course, Benedict Arnold's treason is the icing on the cake, adding insult to injury. As Washington said, Arnold has turned on us. Who can we trust now? So 1780, 1781, it was lining up to be a very bad year. There had been military setbacks for the last 8 months. The economy was bankrupt and in shambles. Also, there were warnings from John Adams, who's overseas, that France is in it for 1 more year. That's it. The French had committed themselves to fight until America became independent, but everyone's patience runs out eventually. There's a sense both in Congress and in the Army headquarters that 1781 was the last year to gain true independence. there had been a rosy glow of optimism over the French alliance that starts in 1778. That was 3 years ago. It seemed like an eternity. Washington had been gambling that if you play the long game with Great Britain, wait them out, that they will give in and just basically throw up their hands. We cannot win this revolution against our former colonies. Washington had remained largely inactive since 1777, fought the battles, of course, to try to keep the British out of Philadelphia, lost both of them. 1778, he attacks the British as they march from Philadelphia back to New York, which they make their headquarters for the remainder of the war, the Battle of Monmouth. That's June 1778. He hadn't really fought a battle since then and wasn't really intent on fighting any. He's now trying to coordinate the Continental Army's efforts with his ally, the French. They're frustrating him. He's frustrating them as well. They both have contrasting battle plans. Washington seems to be obsessed with retaking New York, which the French remind him it's not going to happen. American morale is beginning to wane, especially when you hear about what happens in the South. Arnold's treason. I mean, the most successful and audacious commander for the Continental Army has turned. And of course, France growing impatient. In Europe, there's also a sense, I hinted at this idea last time, that other European nations think the American rebellion is a disruptive force. It's going to hurt their economy. They're wondering how long it can go on. In the last 2.5 years, especially with France joining the United States. Now, American colonial rebellion, okay, what does Russia or Austria care about it? Now those two countries are beginning to ask the European courts if they can propose some kind of peace conference and the blockades that are beginning to impact their respective nations' economy. Can we intervene? Can we bring some type of negotiated settlement? And if the French were able and willing to listen to that, it might change all the rules in the alliance by which the United States said, you fight with us until we gain our independence. But if the French can come back and say, you don't have a plan or a pathway to actually win, that's a dangerous set of circumstances that might develop. The year also opened up with a couple of dangerous pairs of mutinies in the Continental Line. Mutiny. You think about that with the Navy, but yeah, it happens in the Army as well. First, Pennsylvania troops in 1781. New Year's Day, 2 officers wounded by mutineers who have a real list of real and legitimate grievances against the Congress. They hadn't been paid for a year, their food and clothing was inadequate, and their enlistments were essentially over. The man is essentially running the finances of the American Continental Line. Robert Morris basically says in 1780, you know what, we can't pay the soldiers, but we can feed them. No, you really can't. We can provide them shelter. Not so much. You know, there are tents, right? And uniforms and food. That's a dangerous way to assume the Army will stay in their ranks. We give them the basic essentials of life, and things could be worse if they're not in the Army. That is a real big roll of the dice. To say, we've got that for the soldiers at least, right? I mean, hoping they stick around. So, irrelevant of what's happening in European courts or the French impatience or the British wanting to continue this, if the Army goes home, the revolution's over. I mean, Washington realizes that. That's why he doesn't risk it much after 1778. 1,000 soldiers for a week in January 1781 kept Washington up at night, worried about the rebellion spreading to other areas of the Continental Army. The British, of course, encouraged this, sending agents to meet these soldiers to maybe provide financial compensation if they were to up and leave. Those that were actually sent over by the British to talk to the Pennsylvania line were later captured and shot as spies. Washington really, I said last time, wants to capture Benedict Arnold and hang him publicly. He loved that. Or, tried to arrange a plot to kidnap him. Didn't work. They don't waste any time. They just put these guys through a firing squad and it's over. The Pennsylvania government then steps in and promises back pay for the soldiers if they will stay, promises them shirts and shoes and furloughs. A 90-day furlough, meaning 3 months where you can leave the Army if you promise to come back. That's a pretty generous grant, consider the situation. Those that were organizing the mutiny would also be given amnesty. So the officer corps breathes a collective sigh of relief when the Pennsylvania rebellion is over. Of course, there's news that New Jersey, the New Jersey line, some of them had left the camp and were marching towards Trenton, temporarily the location of Congress. Washington, no doubt, is concerned that this response, an overwhelming response by the Continental Army, again, to react to the mutiny of the New Jersey line, might instigate other actions. This is how we deal with mutineers. So he's got to handle the situation very deftly and carefully. Do I send an overwhelming amount of force? Do I kill everybody who was involved? Shoot all the soldiers? The New Jersey instance, however, is much smaller, and news of it spread like an infection through the Army. So if they are going to march and leave the Army and leave without orders the encampment, Washington chooses General Robert Howe, who had lost Savannah in 1778, as a competent officer who was going to track down and round up those mutineers. He does. He brings 500 soldiers to bear. They make a quick march, and he was told he could, quote, instantly execute a few of the most active and most incendiary leaders, unquote. Those are the directions from Washington himself. When he caught them, Howe has the New Jersey soldiers, those who were implementing or instrumental in implementing this rebellion, were pulled aside, and the New Jersey soldiers form a firing squad and shoot two of the leaders who were from New Jersey. This does the trick. Mutiny over. Soldiers return, handled effectively for the most part. But it just reinforces this idea that 1781 has to be the year. Okay, so we'll switch the notes up and we're going to start what we had set aside for today. We're going to return to the Southern Campaign beginning in 1781. In October 1780, again, this is before this year actually starts, but I want to tell you about the process of Greene replacing Horatio Gates. His instructions, Greene's instructions, this is the general Washington wanted in the beginning, but Congress said, we're going to pick Gates because of all of his success he had during the Saratoga campaign in 1777. Washington knows what a lot of generals and officers in the Army know. It was really, Arnold, not so much Gates, who had the success at Saratoga. Greene's instructions from Washington are clear. Bleed Cornwallis to death. Tie him up. Bring him into the interior. Wear him down. And also prevent any reinforcements from moving to the south. If it was possible, Washington thinks it'd be great if the American overall commander, the British commander, would take some soldiers out of New York and send them to the south, but I don't think General Clinton was actually going to do that. Greene leaves and heads south, aware that Cornwallis was already moving into the interior of North Carolina. There was great confusion in the survivors of the Continental Army in the South after the Battle of Camden in August of 1780. To add to these complications, there was another British Army poised to strike in Virginia. So the British plan in the South was working. Everything was lined up in the fall of 1780, and the British would not be denied, they said, any success. On the way south, Nathaniel Greene sees Thomas Jefferson governor of the state of Virginia. He scares him into giving him aid, which is no small task because Jefferson's point of view is, I need soldiers from the Continental Army. I need my militia, everyone who can take up arms in the state of Virginia, to fight the invasion that's happening along the coast. Yorktown, they're targeting Richmond. That's where the capital of Virginia is. He mentions, Greene, to Jefferson that if unchecked, Cornwallis is going to go out of the Carolinas, South Carolina, North Carolina, move into Virginia, and you can bet that he's going to free slaves in Virginia, which of course concerns Thomas Jefferson, a substantial slave owner. He tells Jefferson, quote, on your exertions hang freedom and independence of the southern states, unquote. No pressure, right? It's all on you, Governor Jefferson. And we have that quote from letters that Nathaniel Greene wrote. We have collection of those letters. The papers of Nathaniel Greene are both digitized and, of course, written in bound volumes. They're just a treasure trove of this guy, and who's understood to be one of the individuals who, if anything were to happen to Washington, either incapacitated temporarily or permanently, Greene would step in because he really adopts Washington's strategy, the Fabian strategy. Don't get the army completely annihilated. You wouldn't know it because of Greene's early decisions that he makes, which are bold. Washington would later say, well, you got to do what you got to do, but they were definitely unconventional. When Greene arrives in North Carolina, that's where the scattered army, the survivors that ran away off the Battle of Camden in August, began to gather again. The situation of the Southern Army is pretty bleak. 2,200 men, cold, no money, starving. But Greene, like Washington, is active. He's young, 38 years old. He's a veteran of numerous battles in the North, and he's under no illusions about what he can actually get done in the Carolinas in late 1780 and early 1781. Already in January, Virginia, as Jefferson predicted accurately, is under the gun from a British naval squadron. They sail into the old colonial town of Jamestown. They make their way from Jamestown to Richmond, looting and burning part of the town. It's the third time in 18 months the British raiders had sowed destruction in the state. Greene now has to know he's going to get little help from Virginia. That means he's going to have to raise the soldiers in Georgia, in South Carolina, in North Carolina. And he's not going to really be given any more reinforcements from the North. So Greene reaches out to those partisans I talked about last week, these guerrilla fighters who were in Carolina. Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion. Greene says, look, alone you can definitely do damage, but together when we coordinate our efforts, we're going to do great things possibly. You have to work with the army. Instead of actually going out and leading these campaigns on your own, we can use them, he said, as a force to scrounge material, to forage, to scout, to give him information. And when they can combine their efforts, that would bring some success. Drive cattle. But independently, he said, work with me. Let me organize the overall campaigns. And you can strike out to areas of the southeast of the state. Francis Marion will bring in militia into the west. And he plans a strategy, a very unconventional strategy at the end of 1780. Throw out the playbook and split his undersized army into two. He said it will feed itself better. They'll live off the land. Folks, if you ever read a book on how to be a general, page 1 says, never divide your force in front of a larger force. The larger force, Cornwallis, will then defeat each one in turn. Game over. But Greene says, I don't really have a choice. I've got to go out there and take risks. He sends a division, a group of the army. They're militia, horse soldiers. They're also elements of the Continental Army. what Greene has with him, and this is going to basically be the core veterans of the Army. What he has with him is a group of Continental soldiers. I mean, the Continental Army soldiers, veterans from Delaware and Maryland. They're some of the best soldiers in actually the Army. He sends out west in this corps, this flying camp, he basically calls the Army. They're probably 1,000 or 1,500 soldiers. This is Daniel Morgan. And Morgan is sent out west to the South Carolina backcountry, the northwest corner of the state. So live off the land. Maybe if you can get those over mountain militia. Remember the force that Cornwallis had detached. He had raised Tories, Americans in the Carolinas, to go out and, as the commander said, the Scotsman who was in charge of them, Patrick Ferguson, we were going to lay waste to the area with fire and sword. And people who were like, you know, revolution doesn't affect me, I don't care. When you hear the whole fire, sword proclamation, you're like, nah, I'll go pick up the rifle or the musket. And we talked about the Battle of Kings Mountain. So even after what looks like a complete overwhelming success by the British, they're having some military setbacks. The entire destruction of the Loyalist force at Kings Mountain in October 1780. It means to Greene, he takes from that a lesson. Okay, we can raise soldiers in areas of the Carolinas. With the remainder of his army that he's now divided into two, he takes them into eastern South Carolina and basically tells Cornwallis, chase one or the other. I got one going this way. We're going to move our way into eastern. I mean, he leaves North Carolina. He's going, in fact, on the offensive with two smaller forces and just dares Cornwallis, chase one of us. Well, he does. Cornwallis goes after Greene's main force. It is risky. It's imaginative. It's a daring plan. By the way, the man commanding the army going to the west is Daniel Morgan. I mentioned that already. Here he is. Morgan had been basically the guy who surrendered the American forces at the Battle of Quebec after Benedict Arnold was injured. He fought basically until he was surrounded by a small group of British soldiers. And they said, surrender right now or else. He took his sword out and said, come and take the sword to anyone who dared. And they said, tears in his eyes because he just couldn't imagine that he would have to become a prisoner of war and then, of course, captured. And then he found an unsuspecting priest in Quebec and handed him the sword. And this guy's kind of like, what is going on? And that was, you know, he couldn't bring himself to do that. Daniel Morgan had scars from when he was lashed by a British officer during the French and Indian War. He had been a wagon master during the French and Indian War. This is a guy who, after the lashing, looked back at the guy who hit him with the cat of nine tails and said 100 lashes. I'm pretty sure that was 99. So this is who we're dealing with this guy here. Daniel Morgan was a pretty serious individual. He was also battling back injuries, and he wouldn't stay long in the field, unfortunately, but a very, very interesting, sorry? Riding a horse, probably his spinal sciatica. Is that what it's called? Yes. Sciatica. Yeah, sciatica. Backside. Probably not, but yeah, he said it just became after this campaign where he had the success too painful to get on a horse and just take that pounding on your spine in the saddle. So here he is going out west, drawing part of Cornwallis's army, the flying army as it's called, or the flying camp. Cornwallis doesn't chase Morgan, he chases Greene. And who does he send after Morgan's force? But none other than Banastre Tarleton, the Green Dragoon, the man who had led a group of cavalry soldiers raised in the United States and had been responsible for the Beaufort Massacre after the surrender in Charleston in 1780. So that's meant to instill fear, of course, in Morgan's army. His force consists of about 1,000 soldiers, about maybe a quarter of them, we think, maybe 300 are actual regulars. The rest are militia under this man, William Washington, a distant cousin of George Washington. He's going to command the horse soldiers that Morgan has in his small army. Morgan pulls back. He doesn't flee. He just says, I'm going to pick the ground I want to, moving towards northwestern South Carolina on ground of his own choosing. This is where he chooses to fight. It's a place where cattle drovers brought their herds before taking them to market. So it got the nickname the cow pens. It's an open, undulating field in northwestern South Carolina. It's a national park now. I've been here a bunch of times. It's a battlefield, having toured a lot in my lifetime. Having been to Gettysburg, where 150,000 soldiers just slaughtered each other for 3 days. Going to Antietam, Civil War battle, you have to drive, unless you want to take a really long walk. Usually it's better off to drive to these stops on a Civil War battle. You can see Hannah's cow pens in just one panoramic view. 2,000, 2,500 soldiers all together fought on both sides. And Morgan came up with a brilliant plan. He set up his defense where he would say initially to the riflemen. Let me show you a slide here. We talked a little bit about, didn't get into the intricacies of the Revolutionary War weapons. On the left is a rifle, has a much greater range than the weapon on the right, which is a musket. That's what most of the soldiers carried on both sides. On the left, Morgan had a reputation for using riflemen very successfully. He had been at the Battle of Saratoga. The rifle's great, but what you can't put on a rifle that you can put on the musket on the right is a bayonet. So the rifle takes you at least a minute to load. Skilled soldiers can fire 3, sometimes 4. Some light infantry and the British light infantry, where there were reports of them firing 4 rounds a minute with their muskets, which are rapid fire, but they're not accurate. They're accurate to 50 to 100 yards. The rifle, Morgan's soldiers were doing demonstrations where they could hit targets at 300 yards, which is great. But once you're in combat, you don't have any defensive weapon unless you take the rifle, turn it backwards, and swing it like a club, because you can't put a bayonet on it. So Morgan found out you use riflemen and you use regular infantry with the muskets, less accurate, together. And that's what he did at Hannah's cow pens. You can see it right here. It is a defense of depth. Put some militiamen from North Carolina and Georgia in the front, basically told them, all right, fellas, I need you to fire, and just fell some of the officers. Now, Tarleton's going to come out of the woods there. He's going to be very aggressive. He's going to see a few scattered riflemen. They're not wearing the regular uniforms of the Continental line, and he's going to be overconfident. And then you retreat and make your way to the second line, separated by several yards. Militia. He goes to the camps of these soldiers the night before the battle and says, all I want you all to do, boys, 3 fires. Fire 3 times. And then you go off the field too and gather behind the third line, which are the Continentals, the Virginia and the Maryland veterans. Regroup there, and then militia doesn't stay on the field. When they see horse soldiers running them down, when they see the bayonets glistening from the British regulars, they kind of, run off. But some of these militia had been in the Continental line before, so they were veterans. And so the morning of the fight, he yells to his camp, boys, get up, Benny's coming. That means his scouts have found out that Tarleton's on the way. And so when this whole battle plan works, they get to the third line, the British, we chased off the riflemen in the first row, we chased off the militia in the second row, and they head towards the Continentals. Here they are. The Continental soldiers didn't even pull their guns up to their shoulder. They blazed away from the hip. This painting doesn't even do it justice. This is the painting at the Cowpens National Park in South Carolina. And you can see the British were running full steam right towards the Continental line, thinking we've got them. And from the one side of the painting, you can see the militia. They're in not the uniforms, but a mix of hunting shirts of different colors and kind of other uniforms. They're reassembling. From the other side that you can't see in the painting comes William Washington's cavalry. And you have what in military terms officers dream about. It's called a double envelopment. You just completely on two sides surround all of the British, the Loyalists, the British cavalry. Tarleton himself and William Washington have an exchange of gunfire. They, hit swords a couple times, and Tarleton and his soldiers run off. The Battle of Cowpens is a complete success. Morgan gets 800 prisoners with their weapons, ammunition, horses, cash, and there you have it. There you have it. That part of the plan worked amazingly well. Well, the next part of the plan was that once he heard about, Cornwallis, once he heard about what took place at the Cowpens, he goes in hot pursuit of Nathaniel Greene. Greene also knows that after the Battle of Cowpens, which is right here, you can see it's not too far from the North-South Carolina border, right there in northwestern South Carolina. So once Cornwallis hears about that battle, he says, okay, I'm going to now take out, forget about Greene, I'm going to go after Morgan's force. Furious, he chases Morgan to the northeast. Greene decides, okay, we're going to combine both of our armies yet again. He reunites the army in North Carolina, and the following ensues. This is called in the campaign in the South, the race to the Dan River in Virginia. The race to the Dan. Remember his instructions from Washington. Bleed Cornwallis dry. Cornwallis says, I'm going after the combined army. So what does Greene do? He just keeps retreating through North Carolina into Virginia, the race to the Dan. Greene gets there first, and all the time that he crosses, of course, the river, he pulls up every kind of equipment you use if there's a river crossing, so that the British can't cross the rivers in between North Carolina and Virginia. And the last one he gets to is at the top of the map here, the Dan River. It's a complete and total success, and sometimes the armies get so close that you've got part of Greene's army crossing the river, you've got a force guarding the crossing of the river, they shoot it out with the British, and then they run across the river. Cornwallis's army gets there and says, there's no boats, everything that can float, Greene and his armies have gotten there first, and the whole time you're just stretching Cornwallis further and further away from your supply base. The British lose 250 more soldiers for their effort in now the winter. It's now February 1781. To some, it reminded them of the long retreat across New Jersey in 1776. Greene says, yeah, it reminds me of that too, so it's time to pounce. The whole time Cornwallis is getting weaker, Greene, with the success with the over-mountain men at Kings Mountain and the overwhelming victory at Cowpens, gets more militia to join his force. And that's a good thing. A lot of these Continentals, as I said, who had fought in the South Carolina Continental Line and the North Carolina Continental Line. That makes them experienced soldiers. So where will Greene turn? He had some militia. He has as many soldiers now in this beginning of 1781 as Cornwallis actually does. He turns and re-enters North Carolina to now fight Cornwallis on his choosing in terrain and land as well. By this time, Morgan had left, and he told Greene, look, whatever you do, fight the way I did at the Cowpens. Put the militia up front. He says, and if the militia don't shoot as many times as you want them to, have the Continentals shoot the militia. He said, tell them to fire 2 or 3 times. He said, any stragglers who come back and don't do what they're supposed to do, firing a couple volleys at the British and then retreating back to the safety of the Continental veterans, he said, just shoot them and tell them that ahead of time. If you don't fire 3 times, everybody, you're dead. You died with the British or died with your fellow Americans, one way or the other. So Greene, for the rest of the time, will fight that way. 3 lines. Sharpshooters, militia, second row militia, and then his Continental veterans in the last line, sometimes with artillery, and he'll use also, of course, different elements of cavalry. A little bit different, but the tactics had changed by that point. The problem with the Civil War battles, as far as the amount of casualties, is that the weapons advanced, but the tactics hadn't. So you're able to shoot at a greater distance. They were still fighting battles as if they were using those weapons that were not as accurate. And so what soldiers didn't realize and generals didn't realize until probably the middle of the war, that to fight on the defensive was better for you in the Civil War, because the accuracy of the guns and the massed musketry with rifles now, no really muskets anymore, meant the attackers were going to take these really heavy casualties. And yeah, they were implementing more cavalry tactics, and certainly more elements of accurate artillery in the Civil War. That's what changed a lot. So Greene turns and decides to head back into North Carolina. The other element he's using in his army is cavalry under Henry Lee. His nickname was Light Horse Harry Lee. It's Robert E. Lee's father. American loyalists, American militia, you might say, American militia, not British loyalists, had actually led a successful attack at Tory loyalists at a place called Pyle's Massacre in early 1781. What that does is kind of convince a lot of Americans who might have sided with the British to stay out. And as far as Greene is concerned, that's great. If Cornwallis can't get those soldiers he always thought he was going to get recruited within the United States, he was just going to have to rely on his army, who's gradually getting weaker and weaker as he's pulled farther away from their base of operation, which is Charleston, South Carolina. So he starts the campaign with over 4,000 soldiers. He doesn't have that many. By the time they get to a place near Greensboro, North Carolina, called Guilford's Courthouse. March 15, 1781, a brutal battle follows, a long battle. The British are left the field, which traditionally means that you win the day. Cornwallis had to resort to a pretty awful tactic. When his soldiers reached the Continentals, Greene's Continentals, a melee ensued. The Continental Army actually led a bayonet charge against the British veterans. And Cornwallis saw that and told his artillery, fire into that melee. And they said, but sir, you're going to hit friend and foe alike. He's like, yeah, but we'll probably break up the attack. And he did. He fired artillery right into this mess of soldiers on both sides, and it scattered both of them. And Cornwallis eventually was able to push Greene off the field, but, is it a victory? It's called a Pyrrhic victory. I mean, it looks great, but, you just take heavy casualties. The British lose and win. They win the field, but they lose the battle because their losses are twice that of Greene's army. Cornwallis cannot replace the men that he loses, and that's the trouble. That's where Greene can just say, all right, we're going to continue operations. Things are going to go well. It's encouraging. We'll be able to get more soldiers. It doesn't appear that Cornwallis has that same luxury. The British arms sustain appalling losses in campaigning in the South. They had landed 13 months before with such high hopes. Everything went well, great, swimmingly, starting in 1780. The surrender of Charleston, the rout of Gates at Camden, but the losses add up. Kings Mountain is the first sign. You just annihilate a loyalist force. Americans fighting Americans, that's it, they're at the battle. The only British person there is a Scotsman. He's the officer in charge of the American loyalists. The Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse. The British lose 3,500 men during 1781 and another 1,000 in skirmishes and disease chasing Greene. Horace Walpole, an observer, a member of Parliament, after hearing about the campaign in the South, says, Cornwallis has conquered himself out of troops. Things had turned very quickly. The British general Cornwallis is in the dark about what to do next, but he issues a pronouncement of his complete and total victory. Doesn't really look like it. Not at all. He spent 3 days just getting together his wounded and unable to travel after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and he decides to hightail it to the coastline at Wilmington, North Carolina. There's a Wilmington, Delaware also. That way he can be resupplied by the British Navy from Charleston. So, victory is mine, he says, and then goes off to the safety of a coastal town. The army is tattered and in pieces by the time they reach Wilmington, North Carolina. He spends some time trying to figure out his next move. Would you go out back into the hinterland, resupply? Would you continue this kind of insurgency by which you can replace all the American office holders with loyalists from Great Britain and loyalists from the American colonies? But the Army is not in any position to go on the offensive. Every part of our Army was beat repeatedly, he admits. And it's true. He jokes he would be lucky if he could recruit 100 Tories by the time his army limps its way into Wilmington, North Carolina. He did raise loyalists in 1780, but that seemed like a very, very long time ago. Loyalists are not coming now. Meanwhile, Greene has command of the Carolinas. He's dispersing his forces throughout the two states. He convinces himself the only way to end a rebellion is to close supply lines in the upper South with Maryland and Virginia. He's going to leave the Carolinas. They're pacified anyway, at least he convinces himself. More soldiers were on the way because there was already a British officer there conducting operations in Virginia, Benedict Arnold, who had now sold his services to the British and was being a scourge to Thomas Jefferson. Cornwallis says, I can send my soldiers out of North Carolina and into Virginia and come to the aid of Arnold and other officers there, and leaves the Carolinas. He makes his decision to march into Virginia. He wrote to his commander, Clinton, General Clinton in New York, this is a great plan. This is a solid plan. It's going to work very well. By the time Clinton gets to the note, he's already moving. It's like, I'm asking permission to take the army out of Wilmington. I'm going to reinforce the army that's there in Virginia, and this will be part of the plan, and then we'll sweep into Maryland and reconnect with your army. And before he even gets, a response of you can do this or don't do that, stay where you are, he's moving. It is one of the most fateful decisions in the war, a move out of North Carolina into Virginia by Cornwallis. Washington, meanwhile, prepares for his third meeting with the French commander, Rochambeau, who essentially tells him, your soldiers are at my soldiers, he says, Rochambeau, are at your disposal, General Washington. French forces had been in America for 10 months. They just hadn't been able to coordinate any military attack. There's no combined strategy. Washington still stick to this idea, gosh, it's just not going to go away in his mind, to attack New York. And he's reminded by his own officers and the French General Rochambeau, the British have been there for 5 years and they've turned it into a fortress. So it's not going to be something that you can attack with any success. Rochambeau argues in favor of a Virginia campaign, not even knowing that Cornwallis is there. Strike out against the force that's harassing areas of Yorktown and Richmond, the end of 1780, the beginning of 1781. General Washington, that just makes a lot more sense. There are two armies in the state. Maybe we can score, Rochambeau argues, a significant victory. And then if that is winnable, we'll redirect our efforts maybe to the British Army in the north. The argument got pretty heated, apparently, those who witnessed this. Both men dug in their heels, and Rochambeau is told to defer to Washington. And while Rochambeau says reluctantly, all right, New York it is. I mean, you're the commander. The soldiers are under your command, my soldiers. If it's going to be New York, it's going to be New York. What the French commander doesn't tell Washington is that the French Navy is sailing from the Caribbean to Virginia. Yep.
Why didn't you say that? Tell that to Washington, that they're coming to Virginia.
I don't know.
That would have been simpler, I thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe waiting to see if they actually showed up in Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be my speculation. Yeah. Or maybe he was waiting for a better time to drop the news. They're leaving. That's one thing.
Okay.
To get word that they actually have arrived, and then what happens next seals the deal. But I think he's just keeping that in his pocket for the time being. Yeah, that's a great question. Why not just completely be honest about what's happening? I think he's a little bit uncertain about, destination Virginia. What happens, maybe not. Maybe he's not confident they're absolutely going to go there without a doubt. In July of 1781, the armies, the American and French army, meet up near White Plains, New York, that is north of New York City. By then, Cornwallis has been in Virginia for the last 6 weeks. Greene, meanwhile, he never followed Cornwallis into Virginia. He turned into the Low Country. The British have, by the way, still 8,000 soldiers in Carolina and Georgia. They haven't totally abandoned. He's left Cornwallis. The command in Charleston and Savannah, and then occupying forts in different parts of the Carolinas. Most of the soldiers are in those two cities, but 2,000 are scattered in backcountry posts. Cornwallis kind of almost abandoned any central command, or at least his skill set isn't there, the aggressive commander that Cornwallis is. So Greene realizes if he's not there, his army, his mountaineers, which he nicknames his militia and the other partisans like Pickens, like Francis Marion, like Thomas Sumter. He said, we promise we will beat them all in detail. The scattered soldiers of the British Army are just absolutely vulnerable, and Greene is correct. Within 90 days, Greene does exactly that. He captures 8 British outposts in the Carolinas, fighting 2 battles. The first is at a place near the old Battle of Camden, a place called Hobkirk's Hill. That battle is witnessed by a young teenager named Andrew Jackson, who was captured by the British. We like to say, I don't know why historians say this, but they have their reasons, that it is James Monroe who's the last veteran of the American Revolution who becomes president. Well, this is Andrew Jackson, again, an artist rendering of what took place. He's 13 years old. His older brothers had fought with Carolina militia in 1780 and 1781. His mother had been nursing wounded. And at one point, as a scout, as basically whatever you give a young person to do as far as military responsibilities, Andrew Jackson is captured by the British, brought before a British officer, and says, clean my boots. He says, I'm a prisoner of war, and I will be treated as such. Pretty cheeky for a 13-year-old to say that to a British officer. And this is what happens next. The British officer raised his sword and said something about him being an insolent child, slashed Andrew Jackson, blocked most of the sword thrust with his hand, arm, and part of his face. He'll carry scars for the rest of his life there, and it leaves him pretty seriously injured. You can imagine that Jackson is a patient man. He has his comeuppance. He must have enjoyed watching his soldiers slaughter the British in front of New Orleans several years later, at the end of, after, in fact, the War of 1812 technically ended. After the loss, and Greene loses really the battles he fights. I mean, he leaves the field to the British, but he takes his army out of the fighting, only to fight again. Let me pull up the notes again. He has a mantra that really copies what Washington had always understood. We fight, we get beat, we rise, we fight again. He takes on another British army in southeastern South Carolina, the Battle of Eutaw Springs, fought in September 1781. It's a major battle. The battlefield isn't there anymore because the swamps have kind of taken over that part of the state. Doesn't matter, because even in that loss, the British are down another 1,100 soldiers and are officially pinned to the coastline. Their outposts scattered through the 2 states, gone. He completely reconquers the South. The Virginia Cornwallis enters, meanwhile, in 1781 is weary of war. During the last 2 years, coastal raids by the British Navy and by attacks from soldiers carried in by that Navy have done a lot of damage. Both Governors Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson had summoned the militia to repel the attacks and be on the ready. In 1781, things got worse because it was Benedict Arnold's raid in Richmond that had happened in January of that year, and more soldiers, British soldiers, arrived in the spring. A small fleet sailed up the Potomac River. George Washington would later call them a parcel of plundering scoundrels because they raided and occasionally fired into the plantations along the Potomac River. We know George Washington has a certain plantation along the Potomac River. They spread terror, they ransack, burn residences, destroy shipyards, destroy all the tobacco they could find too in that area, first Jamestown and then Richmond. The HMS Savage sails right past Mount Vernon, confiscating part of Washington's property, leaves the house alone, but liberates 17 slaves, hoping to achieve the same success that he had in Richmond as Benedict Arnold. But Washington deploys Marquis de Lafayette with militia to defend the city. That's where Cornwallis enters the story. And when he does, his famous quote about Lafayette is, "The boy cannot escape me." But he does, and frustrates the effort of both Benedict Arnold and Cornwallis in Virginia. By the spring of 1781, the governor of the state, Thomas Jefferson, is at his wit's end. They've abandoned Richmond, the capital. He fled it twice because he was threatened to be captured himself. He's assailed by people in Virginia for being an absentee governor and for being very tardy in his response to taking any of this seriously at all. Arnold's raid, of course, pressured him relentlessly for the ability to raise men to deploy not only to help Greene in North Carolina, but to defend Virginia itself. Why are the northern states not helping? Jefferson asked. And why is Washington obsessed with this attack on New York? These are very good questions. The answer is, when did the states ever help each other? And going back to when they were actually colonies, Washington and Rochambeau are trying to coordinate an attack. Cornwallis has taken command in the state when he arrives in the summer of 1781, and he looks for a port by which he can be reinforced and possibly, he won't say this, of course, but evacuated if it is necessary. A safe site, in other words. He finds a promising location, a small tobacco port called Yorktown. It's on a peninsula of land between the York and James River. Great place, perfect to set up the army. No threat. Lafayette, of course, had frustrated him by refusing to fight in open battle, to where Cornwallis had said, "I'm going to catch him, I'm going to get him and destroy the army there," but he never is able to. Either is Benedict Arnold. When he learns that the western and southern parts, Cornwallis, of the state are undefended, he sends elements of his fast-moving cavalry to strike out into the west, and it's none other than Banastre Tarleton. Bloody Ban, as he's nicknamed by this point, for his assault on the soldiers who were trying to flee a year before in South Carolina. They ride very quickly across the state towards Charlottesville, Virginia, in the western part of the state. That is also the home of Thomas Jefferson. They are also riding out west because they know the Virginia legislature is meaning. They'd fled Richmond. They're going all the way across the state, as is Governor Jefferson. A native of the town sees the green-clad Green Legion, as it's called, or the American Legion. It's been given a few nicknames. Thunder past the small village of Charlottesville, and he basically runs up to Monticello, Jefferson's home, at 4:30 and says, "Look, you got to get out of here. They're on the move." So not only is Washington's home threatened by a ship sailing past it with the ability to just fire cannon and destroy the whole thing, Jefferson, of course, did the only thing that any politician with that same situation would do. Burned papers, some of them, the state papers, and then headed out and got away before they actually captured him. A slave tells the British that Jefferson had been gone for hours. He'd kind of been gone for minutes, but a very loyal slave to Thomas Jefferson says, oh no, Governor Jefferson, he's long gone, had been gone for a long time. So the soldiers decide to stay on Jefferson's property at Monticello and drink a lot of his wine stash that's there and don't actively go after him. If they did, they hadn't believed this loyal slave to Jefferson, they would have been able to probably catch him. Cornwallis, meanwhile, he can send Tarleton out west, but he's kind of immobile in Virginia at Yorktown. He's got 7,000 soldiers. He wants to head north to New York, but his boss tells him, all right, fine, I want on you going from the Carolinas into Virginia, but now that you're in Virginia, Cornwallis, stay there. That's the orders that he gets. By the time Clinton realizes where he's actually located. Find a secure base that's accessible to the Royal Navy. And that's what you're going to do from this point on. The French army, I said they joined up with the American army, in White Plains in July 1781. Each side marched for the other in a series of parades. This is what you do. This is 18th century pomp and circumstance. You show off the army to each other. The French soldiers notice that the army is young. American army, made up of young recruits. They notice, and they can't help themselves, barefoot. And a quarter of them are black, which the French say, interesting. They marvel at the Rhode Island regiments, which are exclusively African-American soldiers. One observer called them, quote, the most neatly dressed, best underarms, and most precise in its maneuver, unquote, of all the Continental Army. Once Congress gave the green light to recruit African-American soldiers, the Army did, and states did. The Rhode Island already had the recruits. They just said, oh, Congress says we can do it. We already have. Rochambeau tells Washington that the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse is bringing a fleet north. There's the news. They're sailing west, and Washington's like, to New York? De Grasse is like, or Rochambeau's like, no, to Virginia. He's like, oh, okay. That's when Washington gets more flexible about where he might attack the British. Now, all of a sudden, a campaign in Virginia looks a lot more preferable than the campaign in New York. But it does kind of depend on where de Grasse shows up. I mean, we like to think the Army and Navy work seamlessly together, and yes, sometimes they do when it's the Howe brothers. And the Howe, one of them is, of course, charge of the Army early on, and then his brother is in command of the Navy. But Rochambeau can't always speak for de Grasse because with sailing ships in the 18th century, a lot of things can happen. In August, 39 days after the Allied armies are together, word arrives that de Grasse is in the Chesapeake. Game changer, complete game changer. Sensing an opportunity, Washington tells Lafayette, hold Cornwallis in Yorktown at all costs. The army is moving south. Washington, the Allied army, is going to move south. He also has to do something else, which is, move his army and not let the British in New York know that he's moving just about all of his army. So you've got to convince General Clinton, the British general in New York, that an attack on the city is about to happen. Which Clinton says, bring it on. I mean, for the last almost 5 years now, we've been fortifying New York. So Washington marches armies, soldiers to New Jersey. That's where the attack will be launched from. And Clinton says, all right, here we go. Washington must have loved that he's following the same route of his retreat from 1776, that he's going to be following across New Jersey. And the soldiers who are stationed in New Jersey mask and screen the movement of most of his army because they're going to move by land and by sea in 1781. Let me show you the slide here because it is a pretty impressive movement across the state. And then part of it's going to be done by sea. Here's the Yorktown campaign August to September 1781. News of the French Navy reinforcing by another flotilla from New England brings even more welcome news. The French had a force off the New England coast. They had attempted to lead an assault on Rhode Island, and Washington had been frustrated by that as well. Now the French fleet is larger than the British fleet off the Virginia coast in the summer of 1781. Lafayette tells Washington he has confined Cornwallis in Yorktown. When he gets that news, Washington does something very, very uncharacteristic. He grabs Rochambeau and puts him in a bear hug. Washington, not outwardly emotional guy. The French officer later says that Washington, quote, put aside his character as arbiter of North America and contented himself for the moment with that of a citizen, happy at the good fortune of his country, a child whose every wish had been gratified, would not have experienced a sensation more lively, unquote. No one was sure where the Allied army was going, but they were on the move. French and American armies were going by land and sea to Virginia. They then take the move across the Chesapeake Bay, destination Virginia. And then there's more good news. You can see it marked at the bottom of the map. In September of 1781, de Grasse and his navy defeat the British fleet at the Battle of the Virginia Capes, scatter the British Navy. They can't stay off station in Virginia any longer, can the British fleet. Cornwallis, said differently, trapped, unless his army can start, swimming for it. It's called by one historian, and I think accurately, you can't underestimate the importance of the Battle of the Virginia Capes, the most important naval engagement of the 18th century. There's been a lot of them. That's right up there. Hard to argue with that. Early in September, Cornwallis knows that the trap is set. The enemy armies begin to move in after him. The Navy is defeated. Some officers urge him to break out against Lafayette. Fight your way out of Yorktown. But he stays. He decides it's safer to remain in Yorktown than to go on the run. There's a good military strategy for that. I'll dare them to coordinate a siege army there in Yorktown than to fight out of Yorktown, which is unlike him. If he abandoned the Carolinas and Virginia, that's the other part of the story. If you leave Virginia to go up, Central Virginia, go into Maryland, I think it's absolutely unthinkable for him. He's by nature a pretty aggressive commander. The army would have to forage for food, and that's not really an option. He's uncertain about his army's ability to live off the land if we were to break out of Yorktown and head into Central Virginia. He also hears that there is a relief expedition on the way from the north. Clinton's going to send him soldiers. But that's held up because the ships needed to move the New York British Army part of it down to Virginia are out for repair. His hope, you can imagine where he goes, sir. Oh, great, we're going to get a relief force, even though the Navy's been scattered by the French. And then he hears the news that no, the ships aren't really ship-worthy or seaworthy to go out and send you the soldiers you need from New York, from Virginia, and that's when it hits him. Cornwallis is alone and under siege by the fall of 1781. Go back to the notes here. Well, I think I'll leave the dramatic Yorktown campaign for class next time, because we can also talk about the aftermath of the battle. How do we get from the Yorktown battle in the campaign, October 1781, to taking nearly 2 years for the British to effectively agree to peace and the independence of their former colonies? That's the process we're going to talk about next time, because after the Yorktown campaign, the British have options. Keep fighting. The king wants to keep going. Some members of the king's immediate inner circle want to keep going. But the game changer for why the revolution ends in 1781 effectively are the British people. And that story is one we'll talk about next time. Go ahead. Well, not necessarily. He has mini seizures that people around him know the signs of. And what they do, again, there have been stories of him talking to a tree, you know, like it's someone, an old friend of his or his grandfather's, the King George II. I think some of those stories were used for political purposes, but he definitely has, and accelerating as he gets older, health issues. And yeah, they even made a movie about it called The Madness of King George. And it came off that way. And so he would have handlers around him who said that he might stutter or he might show the telltale signs of when he would go into that behavior. And so he would be pulled away and isolated. And then, of course, kings didn't make a lot of public appearances, but you also wanted to, you know, have the confidence of the people and members of parliament. And it got a little worse toward the end of his life. So, but he's still relatively young here. I mean, he would be, you know, probably in his 50s now at the end of the, because he becomes king, he's in his 30s, and that's 1760. So yeah, he's still relatively young, maybe old by those standards, but relatively young by the standards of 1781.
I mean, because I always thought of the stress of having him losing the colonies, it also could have exacerbated or like made his health issues worse.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the experts on that know when that started and if that was a part of it, if it made it worse for him. I'd be curious to see that. I can't speak on that with any authority or when that's, you know, what point of his life that started and if this whole episode of the 1760s and 70s made it worse because, you know, he's king until, gosh, what, 1820? When's that? 1830. Maybe a little earlier than that. I know through at least in the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, and then there's right, exactly. Yeah. Well, you know, some people in England and the United States would call that war kind of a draw, but nevertheless, yeah, they called it back in the Second American Revolution. People who lived through it. So they said, you know, we had some unresolved issues with the English, and now we probably got it figured out at this point. So, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so once again, for those of you on Teams, we've got the last assignment. It's the electronic book that I said in the syllabus was an ebook. So read chapter 1 of that. You're going to have to be responsible for that material for the final exam that we give out at the last day of class. We'll post online again. We will be here Thursday, so we will see everybody Thursday to talk about the Yorktown campaign and that difficult 2-year period from Yorktown until the final treaty, which actually ends the American Revolution, why it took 2 years, why it took a long time, and what happened in between. All of that next time. Okay, thank you all for coming and for joining us on Teams, and we'll see you here Thursday.